Dr. Carson, I have two questions. Thank you very much for sharing with us your experience this morning. So one question is about the first part, which is on expository preaching. I still find that the notion of expository preaching is still a hard sell, sometimes within our churches itself, both to the people who run the church as well as the church members. Maybe it's because the people who do expository preaching have not been doing it well. So the impression is that it is dry, it is, there's no power, there's no action, there's no transformation. So, so my question is, how can we get people to embrace expository preaching? That's the first question. The second question would be on when you preach an evangelistic sermon, where does the place of the call to respond to the gospel come in? I've noticed that you have taken a different style over the last 2 nights. You have not done what is traditionally called an altar call. So where does that come in? Because in the Bible, sometimes the question comes up, what then shall I do to be saved? So at what point, how and when do we actually make the call?
On your first question, there is no doubt some truth in the charge that many people who claim to be doing expository preaching are doing instead a kind of exegetical lecturing, and they are boring. But that's one of the reasons why I tried to give some hints in the first session this morning of the importance of getting a burden. I kept saying things like, the commitment to expository preaching does not exempt you from the responsibility of being interesting, which requires imagination and thought. You see, anybody with a little bit of education can learn the techniques of exegesis and figure out what the third genitive absolute from the right means in the text. The creative part of preaching is the hardest part. How you build an outline, how you apply it to life, the language you use to make the text sing and sting. That's the part that demands more thought and creative energy. And that must not be focused on at the expense of getting the text right. You have to start with the fact that you're unpacking the text. That's what exposition means. You're unpacking, you're expounding what the text says. But at the end of the day, that doesn't give you the right to feel exempted from the responsibility to package things in a way that grabs your attention. Now, some of that can be taught. Some of it can be taught. A lot of it is actually learned by good models. So it's why I do recommend that people listen to able expositors. In other words, you can always downplay a movement by finding bad examples. But nowadays, one of the strengths of the web is that you can find able expositors in different cultures who are doing things a little bit differently, but nevertheless are ably, fairly, creatively expounding the text. One of the things we try to do when we put together our conferences, all of our conferences, the plenary sessions, are expositions. But we purposely choose preachers who are really quite diverse. So their styles are different, even though they're all really deeply committed to expository ministry. But the way they hold you is really quite different. So if John Piper is preaching, I don't know if you've ever heard him. Have some of you have seen him on video or something preach? Some of you not. John Piper in the North America, he's very American. He's really very, I can't imagine him fitting quite in some context of the world, but he's very intense. And he starts preaching and you wonder where he's going. It feels a bit confusing, but it's so intense, and then finally breaks out some truth from the Word of God, and you think, ooh, that was good, and more truth, and suddenly he's grabbed you, and you think, this is fantastic, But that's his style. I don't want people to try to become Little Johns. And then there's Tim Keller. Tim Keller feels like a Midwestern college professor. Well, I guess what I'd say is that this text means such and such. I mean, he's so laid back. You think he's going to put you to sleep. But in point of fact, as you listen to him, somehow his words grab you and you're drawn along because it's creative, it's thoughtful, it's faithful to the text and so on. Very, very different styles. And then there's Crawford Loritz, who's an African-American preacher. Years and years worked with Crusade and now pastoring a church that is about 85% white in the South, and he's African-American. He's a terrific preacher, but another style again. He just feels black. What can I say? I mean, and he's good. He's really good. And so we line up all of these different preachers you see at our conferences precisely because I want people to hear exposition, but I don't want people to think that exposition has only one cultural, social, personality stamp. And what I recommend that people do, if they're committed to exposition, besides trying to learn some of these things and reading books like Miller's Saving Eutychus and things like that, also listen to some of these preachers, not only for their content, but analyzing how they're doing it. Think through how they're doing it and learn from them. Now, there may be particular preachers in your subculture that you know about better than I do. And so I don't want to tell you. I mean, I know the preachers in the English-speaking world and in the French-speaking world pretty well. Some of the Spanish-speaking world, I don't know preachers in the Chinese world. Because every time I'm invited to the Chinese world, or to the Indian world for that matter, every time I'm the one who's the speaker. So I don't hear anybody else. You know, you're the guys that have got to find out who's. Go and talk to him. That's his problem. So you've got to find out who your models will be, but look around for the very best models that you can find, and analyze. Not only listen to whether they're actually handling the Word of God well. That's the first thing, but listen also to whether. To how they're maintaining interest, how they're engaging with people, how they're grabbing people, do you see? And learn from those things. So there are ways of fixing that. There's no doubt about it. I still think that one of the biggest reasons why people don't do more expository preaching is not because there are bad examples around. There are always bad examples around. That's never going to change. There'll be badder examples around until Jesus comes back. The biggest reason is expository preaching, to do it well, is hard work. It really demands a priority in your time commitments. It doesn't just happen. Now, as for the second question, which was? The invitation system. It's worth getting a bit of historical perspective before I answer that. The invitation system, inviting people forward at the end of a meeting, is a relatively recent cultural development, about 200 years. That's it. So across 2,000 years of Christian history, that's pretty small. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no place for demanding response, but that's not the only way to demand response, to come forward down an aisle. That received its strongest impetus in the English-speaking world under the ministry of a chap called Finney. And in my view, a lot of his theology was a bit questionable as to how he did it. On the other hand, it has been used fruitfully by many people across the years and in many cultures, so I'm not going to speak against it. On the other hand, what I will speak against is the notion that that's the only way that you can demand response. The last two nights here, I've reserved a minute or two at the end of the sermon to say something like, if God is speaking to you in your own mind and heart now, even where you sit, you can lift your heart and mind heavenward and say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And if I were in a whole evangelistic series, I will say things like that. But then I will also always, in an evangelistic series, provide a room afterwards for people to go to where they can talk to people. So that instead of demanding that they come forward now, go to a room. That means that you can invite not only people who have made professions of faith, but people who just have ongoing questions. Do you see? So that's still demanding. There are ways of demanding that people respond to things right through the sermon. At the end of each major point, not merely at the end where the only possible response that is considered a response is coming forward. That's a relatively recent historical invention. Now, again, I'm not opposed to it. I'm opposed to anybody who says that's the only thing that that shows that you're demanding a response. Do you see? So within that framework, I think there are lots of ways of demanding a response. Even the burden of the sermon itself, with demanding responses within the structure, but also at the end, in inviting people, even in a context where I'm not in charge, I'm just the speaker, and they haven't provided anything afterwards. I will say something like, if you have closed with Christ as a result of this meeting, then afterwards I want you to come and tell me, because I'd like to give you some literature that might help you in the first stages of your Christian pilgrimage. So there are ways of doing that too. Do you see? So there are lots and lots of ways of pressing the point without being too invasive or demanding one particular cultural form. In some societies, coming forward at a meeting is pretty daunting, especially if the surrounding culture is certainly going to persecute you if you abandon your background and become a Christian. If Shariah is in the background, give the poor bloke some time as he's trying to figure out what the cost is before he actually closes with Christ. Do you see? Yes.
Dr. Carson, thank you for your sharing and lecture. Just one curious question. In your example on John series, when you share this message at Melbourne, I noticed that you left out John 4 as your evangelistic message series. I think apart from John 3 and John 4 are, for me, in my background, but I heard one of the most common message that used as the evangelistic message or preaching, So I just thought, I'm curious, is there any purpose that you left that out, or you may have?
My dear brother, I could have preached evangelistically from other chapters that I omitted, including 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Do you see? I mean, the thing is, if I was only given 5 nights and there are 21 chapters, I had to leave a few things out. So it wasn't vicious condemnation on my part.
I'm a new Christian. I only started the Bible when I retired. And I have a lot of information behind me because I was a Confucius upbringing, and also I am a Buddhist, Zen Buddhism and the Buddhism that practice.
Keep it close to your mouth, sweetie.
As you know. Yeah. So, as I see around the church scene here, you've been preaching this expository preaching, but I have seen a lot of preaching that is like a Woodstock. I grew up in the flower generation. Woodstock is like you go to a preaching scene, you have songs, you have things, you have lights, you have all these things. I'm quite worried about the younger generation that seems to come out of the preaching and say, I'm so ecstatic, I'm filled with the power of God. What do you think of this sort of scene? This is my worry.
So the question is, does evangelistic preaching have to sound like Woodstock? Is that it? And does everybody know what Woodstock means, or is that just too American by half? Woodstock was a seminal rock concert in the 1960s that sort of captured the imagination of mind you, the number of people who claim to be at Woodstock is about 3 times the total population of the United States. It was a pretty big event. There were maybe 100,000, 140,000 people there. It was a pretty big event. But everybody and his cousin claims to have been to Woodstock. And it's become a sort of mythical thing in our past now. Were you at Woodstock? At least for people of my age, Now, there are a bunch of sort of aging hippies. And it became a sort of cultural icon for getting together in a happy, clappy frame of mind and sing protest songs and sleep together under the blue skies in open tents and drink a lot of drinks and get some drugs. That was Woodstock. So by suggesting that some of our evangelistic preaching sometimes is in the context of what sounds like an evangelicalized Woodstock, the charge is pretty serious. But I take your point. I take your point. Because part of what is going on, it's often well-intentioned, but not very well thought through. That is, if you can make bridges toward the culture, and they like that kind of music, so we produce a Christianized version of that kind of music, and so on, and get everybody in the right mood. That's the idea. Oh, some people do that sort of thing reasonably well. There is a movement in African American Christianity now called hip-hop. It's not my favorite music. And the worst hip-hop is really vulgar, and it's sexually explicit and grotesque and rapacious. It's pretty disgusting. But some people, some African Americans, have got converted out of that background and have started writing some Christian hip-hop. Shai Linne and people like that. And they were smart enough to run their lyrics by people like Mark Dever and others of us on the Gospel Coalition Council. And their lyrics are absolutely fantastic. Now, I don't like the style of music, but boy, I'm not going to criticize their words. There was one of the guys that put together what he called the Westminster Rap. And he lays out the main categories of the Westminster Catechism. And I mean, it's unbelievable. It's not my style of music, but nevertheless, I'm not going to start throwing brickbats at it. And after our big conference at a large hall in Chicago 3 years ago, our conference finished at 12 o'clock. But we had the building till midnight. So we invited Shai Linne and 2 or 3 others with him, who's become quite a strong evangelistic preacher, and invited anybody who wanted to come to a Shai Linne hip-hop concert. 4,000 came, almost all African Americans from the south side of Chicago. And believe me, it's not my style of music, but the content was absolutely superb. So you have to make allowance for the fact that sometimes God uses styles and so on that are not ours. But in the case of Shai Linne, he's doing so without theological compromise. He's brutally blunt. He's very clear on what the gospel is, and the nature of repentance and holiness and the justice of God and what the cross achieves. I mean, he really is an evangelical Christian of the strongest confessional water, but with a style that's not mine. So you want to make allowances for things like that too, and not become too narrow and think that the only acceptable hymns are those that were written in the Victorian era. Or we might go back as far as Wesley, but before that, it was bad, it was dull, it was boring. Gregorian chants are out, and anything after about 1910, the skids are in, and it's all going to the pit. So you do have to realize that there are different styles along those lines, and make some allowances. Having said that, against what you've suggested, I do think that a fair bit of evangelistic preaching is sometimes set in contexts that are so compromised with half-baked music and half-baked lyrics and corny sentimentality and stuff that's not tough-minded. And I would argue that the more biblically ignorant people are today, the more they need to see a Christian counterculture. Not a movement that's sort of half-slid in their direction, but a Christian counterculture that nevertheless knows how to talk to people from another culture. And so the kinds of evangelistic ministries that I like best, well, take Tim Keller. He's in New York City, which is extremely secular. I mean, they use a Presbyterian style of service, liturgy, and the whole bit on Sunday morning. But nevertheless, the average age in his church is 32. And people are getting converted left, right, and center. Clarity of exposition, understanding, those are more important things than the particular style of music. And to be too compromised with sloppy sentimentality on the long haul does not feed the cause of the gospel, in my view. Even if it's not quite as bad as Woodstock.
Dr. Hello, 1, 2. Okay. Dr. Carson, I have 2 related questions. One is, if you are in a context of, again, expository preaching, evangelistic one, what ratio of your time would you allocate to answering the questions? And the second thing, if you are pressed for time and they give you a list of questions, what question would you choose to answer or choose not to answer?
First, the majority of your time needs to go into exposition. Questions can fill any vacuum. But in my view, the majority of your time needs to go into exposition in order to provide the framework for the questions to be focused and to make sense. If you haven't provided enough content in the first place, then the questions are going to be asking things that you should have already dealt with in your exposition. Good preaching answers a lot of questions as you go along. Paul does that. It's called the diatribe style, where he asks the question of a theoretical opponent. You will say, then why does God condemn? And I say, and he answers back. You see? So he's raising questions from a theoretical audience as he's reading their minds, as it were. Do you see? So preachers, as part of their expositions, can in fact already be answering, by way of anticipation, questions that he expects at the end of the message. So I would still say that the majority has really got to be given to exposition of Scripture, the majority. Then secondly, sometimes when I preach evangelistically and use Genesis 1, 2, and 3, for example, the questions I fear are not questions from the secularists. They're not questions from Muslims who may be present. They're not questions from nearby friendly Buddhists. No. The questions I fear are from Christians who want to stand up and score points. You explain that it's an evangelistic series and you're talking to non-Christians, and sure as shooting, some 18-year-old's going to get up and say, Mr. Carson, are you supralapsarian or infralapsarian? What I want to do is wring their scrawny necks. Now, in point of fact, I'm happy to answer that question, but I'm not happy to answer it in an evangelistic setting. What planet are they on? Do you see? So if I have access to some of these Christians before the event, I tell the Christians to shut up. I don't want their questions. They can get me another time. It's not a place to show off either. I'll tell you another problem sometimes in evangelistic setting. I don't mind in this context where we're all Christians and if somebody wants to come up and give me a book to sign or have a picture taken, everybody's got a cell phone, so everybody's got a camera. That's the way the culture is. But when I have people coming forward to ask serious questions about the Lord, I don't want some Christian citing, and please may I have my picture taken. I'm talking to a Muslim about Jesus, and some bloke wants his picture taken. And once again, I want to wring some scrawny necks. So if I have access, you see, to some of these Christians in advance, I openly say, keep your cameras at home. This is not a place for guru stuff, You're thinking and praying about the non-Christians who are present. I don't want a single Christian to ask for his picture. I want you to be praying for and answering questions of non-Christians. So you need to be doing the kinds of things that further the cause of the evening, which is evangelism. Now, in that context, then, to have somebody receiving questions on SMS, somebody you can trust, and who filters them and then put them on a screen, that relieves you a lot of responsibility. So in the Melbourne context, I didn't see the questions in advance. They were being filtered in, but I had a guy, Peter Adam, who was receiving them all, filtering them all, and he put up the best ones up on the screen. I trust him. He knows what I want in any case. You see, we're working together. And so, in fact, that's what's happening a bit on these nights, too, together. So there are ways of setting up structures to filter some of this stuff out so that it's handled automatically. Does that help? There was a question back there?
Yes, Dr. Carson. In the local church preaching settings, would you argue that all preaching or all sermons in expository preaching must be pointing to Jesus Christ? The reason I ask this is because, let's say that if we are preaching from a book in the Old Testament, some of it is easier, but some of it is harder. And yes. Is it possible of running the risk of trying too hard to try to connect them together? Thanks.
That's a very good question. There are some expositors who stick so narrowly to the immediate text at hand in the Old Testament that they find it really difficult to get to Jesus. So they can expound for 10 weeks on, let's say, Jeremiah, or some of the Psalms and not really mention Jesus once except in the closing prayer. John Calvin was often guilty of that. Now, he compensated in the context of his ministry in Geneva by virtue of the fact that in his Old Testament expositions, in my view, he fell off the cliff that way. But he was not only preaching from the Old Testament. In any given week, he was speaking between 5 and 11 times. And at the same time, he was giving his expositions of the institutes of the Christian religion, his systematic theology, which is loaded for bear with how the whole Testament, both Testaments interact with each other. So in the context of his whole ministry, he was putting the Bible together pretty well. But in the context of his Old Testament expositions, I don't think he did it particularly well. What do you learn from that? I would say that most of us are not preaching 11 times a week. We're not actually including one address that's on Jeremiah and another address that's on the institutes of the Christian religion. So that you have to aim to do more integrative things in the times when you do have the people of God gathered to hear the Word of God. So one of the definitional points that I gave you in expository preaching, if you recall, is that ideally, expository preaching is looking for the inner canonical connections that actually drive you to Jesus Christ and the gospel. That means the people who know their biblical theology best, who know the great strands of Scripture that run through, so that when they butt up against one, they automatically see how it goes backwards and forwards. Those who know their biblical theology best will also best be able, when they're doing Old Testament exposition, to get to Jesus naturally. Those who don't know much biblical theology, when they do leap to Jesus, are often going to sound artificial. So this becomes an incentive, therefore, for those who are doing exposition from Old Testament texts to read deeply and widely in biblical theology so they learn how to make easier, more natural connections toward Jesus. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to sound as if in your preaching the New Testament hasn't happened yet. You want, when you're preaching, to locate the particular text you're preaching from within its own historical, theological, literary context. That's right. You don't want to read it anachronistically. That's right. At the same time, you're not preaching as an Old Testament Jew. You're preaching as a Christian. This side of the cross and the resurrection. This side of the dawning of the church. So it does become part of your responsibility to teach Christians how to read the Old Testament Christianly. And that means figuring out how more of these biblical theological strands work, or else really what you're teaching people to do is how to read the Old Testament scriptures as if you're an Old Testament saint. There's something inadequate with that. Does that help at all? Now, in fact, to lay that out in more detail would demand that I have hours and hours of your time to give you lots and lots and lots of examples. Tomorrow at STM, when I'm in chapel, I'm going to expound Genesis 39, the temptation of Joseph. And that will be another way of showing how you move from an Old Testament text, the temptation of Joseph, to the New Testament. So if you want to see another example, I'm sure it'll be recorded. You're not allowed to say anything anywhere in the world nowadays without somebody recording it. So if that's a help to you, then get that one. It'll be one more text that you can tuck under your belt for how to make the connections. I think this is the last one.
Okay, Dr. Carson, regarding expository preaching, how do you manage people like Rob Bell in his book, Love Wins? Because oftentimes people want to take the gospel in the easy way out.
Yes.
To sound nice for them, to feel good so that they can accept the gospel. As we are preaching the true gospel in all its contexts, and when people come up with us in regards to what Rob Bell says, how do we actually address this issue with him?
Well, let's take Rob Bell as a specific example. Rob Bell has changed his position. Does everybody know what we're talking about here, who Rob Bell is? Rob Bell was an evangelical preacher in the city of Grand Rapids whose ministry grew from just a few hundred to 10,000 in the course of about 5 or 6 years. And initially, he was broadly evangelical conservative, who, with a slightly edgy, with a slight edginess to his style and so on. When I wrote my book on the emerging church movement that was published in 2005, I debated whether or not I would include him, but at the time I excluded him. I didn't think he was edgy enough to be considered part of the emerging movement. 2 or 3 years later, it would have been very different. He was right at the center of the emerging movement, and eventually he moved so far left you needed field glasses to see him. And eventually he went so far that he really became a 1920s liberal with sort of postmodern chat thrown into his discourse. So his book titled Love Wins. He'd written several other books before that were troubling. But that book, Love Wins, was really playing with universalism and implicitly denying substitutionary atonement and really diluting the notion of the wrath of God and so on and so on and so on. And as it happened, that book came out just 2 or 3 days before the national conference of the Gospel Coalition 3 years ago in Chicago at McCormick Place. We had about 7,000 people there. And we knew his influence would be so great that we needed to do something about it. And so great, in fact, that American Time magazine splashed him, I think on the front cover, but certainly a major article on Rob Bell and the new evangelicals and yada, yada, yada. And you see, if we waited 6 months to do something and then we posted something, by that time the world has moved on. So he's had his impact, and we show up as Johnny-come-latelys, merely whining a wee bit without any influence at all. And so one of the rules of the digital world is that if you're going to do something, it's got to be done well and fast. So we assigned one of our guys to write a review of the book. We got an advanced copy, and we waited until the Time article was released, and we released the review the same day as the Time article appeared. And it was about 7,000 words long, and not only did the guy write the review, he was competent, it was Kevin DeYoung, but he circulated the review amongst 4 or 5 of us so that we had a lot of theological minds reading this whole thing, getting it right, first of all, in tone and emphasis and so on. And then when the Time article appeared, somebody in ABC, who was high up in their news department, he phoned me and said, "Hey, look, I'm going to interview Rob Bell this afternoon on TV. This is a big deal. What do I need to know?" I said, "All you need to know is go and read Kevin DeYoung's review." And I gave him the URL. So on national television, he asked the same questions that Kevin had just posted on our website. And Rob Bell was, quite frankly, decimated. He had no idea how to answer. And then we inserted an additional section. I mean, our whole program was made up 18 months in advance of the conference. But because this was making such a big splash in the North American context, we said, you know, our program tomorrow morning begins at 9 o'clock. But if anybody is interested in another session, we've arranged a session at 7:30 in the morning. It'll go for an hour and a half until the first session officially begins. And I spoke for 45 minutes on the history of universalism and how the Bible responds to it. And then we had a panel made up of 5 of us, including Tim Keller, Kevin DeYoung, myself, Stephen somebody else, I forgot who it was, that answered questions from the audience. 4,000 people came for that session. All of that was recorded video. It's still downloadable for free. So we had that thing posted lickety-split. Do you see what I mean? And as a result, to be quite frank, that whole thing fizzled pretty fast. It made it splash in sort of leftish circles, but it didn't really rock the boat with ordinary Christians because there was a sensible, low-key, faithful, exegetical response delivered without malice, without condescension, but pretty straightforward, And as a result, the whole thing died. It just died. It was dead as a dodo in 3 months, 4 months. So if that is beginning to be faced by you today in KL or some other place, I've just read this book by Rob Bell. I mean, it's really troubling me. Or alternatively, I just read this book by Rob Bell. It's the greatest thing since the invention of rice. Then what I would say is, I think you need to go and look at these 2 URLs. Kevin DeYoung's review, and then the whole video of the talk on universalism and the corresponding panel discussion. It really is powerful stuff that is biblically grounded. So nowadays, on many of these troubling things that come along, there are some resources out there, if you know where to look for them, that can help you and be a shortcut to a lot of helpful materials that give strength to you and to the people that you're serving as pastor.